I was sitting at my parents' dining table on Saturday afternoon when I heard my older brother use the phrase, "what we've already agreed on," for the third time in 2 minutes. I want to be precise about that moment. Not the first time he said it, when I had assumed it was a loose turn of phrase. Not the second time, when something had gone still and attentive in my chest. The third time, when he was pointing at a hand-drawn diagram of the property boundary and explaining to my parents how the eastern parcel would be handled based on what Nathan and I discussed, was when I understood exactly what kind of meeting I was sitting in. I had not agreed to anything. I had not been asked about anything. I had not been told this meeting would be about the property at all. I had been told it was a Saturday lunch. I let him finish the sentence. Then I picked up my phone, opened the message thread between my brother and me going back 6 months, and set it face up on the table in front of my parents. There's a version of that moment where I explain what they're looking at. I did not do that. I let them read. The property had been in my family for decades. What happened at that table on a Saturday afternoon was not really about the property. It was about who I had been in that family for 30 years. The younger brother who could be spoken for, whose silence could be translated into consent, whose presence in a room could be used to confirm a version of events he had never agreed to. That was the story my brother had been counting on me to finish. I did not finish it. My mother called on a Tuesday evening, the way she calls, unhurried, a little roundabout, arriving at the point after a few minutes of other things. She said it had been a while since the family had been together. She said Mark would be there. She suggested Saturday at noon and asked if I could come. I said I could. She asked if I would bring a bottle of wine. I said I would bring 2. She did not mention property. She did not mention a decision. She did not use the word meeting. The land had been in the family for 20 years. My grandfather had left it to my parents when he died. 11 acres outside the city, a small cabin on the eastern edge of it, a creek that ran along the property line in spring. When Mark and I were young, it had been a summer place, the kind of unremarkable constant that children do not think about because it has always simply been there. We had spent weeks out there every July. We had stopped going as often once we were adults, and the summers filled up with other things. In the last few years, the area had changed. Development had moved in that direction, and property values had followed. The land was not something my parents talked about openly, but I knew, in the approximate way you know things in families, that it was quietly worth more than most people would have guessed. More, certainly, than a piece of land with a 40-year-old cabin on it had any obvious right to be. I arrived on Saturday, a few minutes before noon, with the wine, and let myself in through the side door the way I always did. The house smelled like something had been in the oven. My mother called from the kitchen. My father was in the dining room already, sitting in his usual chair, and he looked up when I came in and said my name and smiled, but the smile had something careful behind it. He glanced down at the table, and then back at me, and then away, and I registered the glance without knowing yet what to do with it. The table was set for 4. That was the first thing. The second thing was the folders. There was one in front of my mother's seat, one in front of my father's, one in my brother's place. They were the kind of folders a real estate broker keeps, clean, tabbed, the contents visible as a slight thickness beneath the cover. Professional. Prepared. There was no folder at my seat. Mark came in from the kitchen behind me and clapped me on the shoulder with a broad, warm confidence he has always moved through rooms with. He gestured at the table. Sit down, he said. We're just going to walk through what we've already agreed on so Mom and Dad can see it laid out. I looked at him. What we've already agreed on? Yeah, the property thing. He was already moving toward his seat, already opening his folder. Take your seat. I took my seat. I did not have a folder. I looked at my father, who was looking at the cover of his, and I thought about the glance he had given me when I walked in, and I sat in the chair that had been set for me at a table I had not known was a meeting, and I waited to hear what I had apparently already agreed to. The pattern had been running for 30 years. I had just never added it up in a single sitting before. As children, Mark had been the family spokesman by default. The older one, the louder one, the one who arrived at my parents with the consolidated position of the boys already formed and ready to present. What the boys wanted to do that weekend. what the boys thought about the family vacation, what the boys had decided about the argument that had happened in the back seat on the way home. He was 6 years older, which at 12 and 6 had meant he was simply more convincing than I was, and by the time I was old enough to have a distinct position of my own, the role had already been cast. I had let it stand because he was usually close enough to right that correcting him felt like making something out of nothing. The adult version was the same dynamic, wearing a different set of clothes. Mark had coordinated our parents' insurance after their old broker retired through a friend of his because he knew someone and it was easier. Mark had managed the paperwork when they refinanced the house because he was in real estate and understood the process. Mark took care of things. He delivered that phrase with a particular small exhale, the exhale a man doing the room a favor, and no one pushed back on it because the things did, in the end, get taken care of. My mother trusted him with logistics the way she had always trusted him with logistics. My father watched more than he spoke, had always watched more than he spoke, and if he had formed conclusions about what he was watching, he had kept them to himself. I had kept myself useful in different ways. I was the one they called when something structural needed to be understood, when a contractor's estimate needed to be read carefully, when a document required someone who would actually go through it page by page. My mother called this being good with details. It had never occurred to me to examine the difference between being good with details and being allowed to deal only with details, between being trusted and being managed. 2 years earlier, Mark had told my parents that I had agreed to host Christmas. I had not agreed to host Christmas. I had said, when he raised it over the phone, that I would think about it. I had meant that I needed to talk to my wife about it, that we had her family schedule to consider, that it was not a small thing, and I was not going to commit to it in a 10-minute call. I had said I would think about it clearly and specifically, and Mark had apparently translated that into yes. By the time I found out what he had told them, the family had already adjusted their plans around the assumption. Backing out would have meant my parents rearranging things they had already rearranged, would have meant a conversation about why I had changed my mind about something I had never agreed to in the first place, would have meant making a scene over Christmas hosting when the simpler thing was to just host Christmas. I hosted Christmas. Afterward, I had said something to him, not angrily. I did not tend toward anger with Mark. I said that I had told him I would think about it, and that thinking about it and agreeing were not the same thing, and that I would have appreciated being asked rather than told. I told Mom you'd do it, he said. Didn't think you'd mind. I said I'd think about it, Mark. Same thing, he said. It had not been the same thing. I had known it then, and noted it, and filed it away under the long heading of things that were not worth the energy they would cost to relitigate. I had told myself it was harmless. I had told myself it was just how Mark operated, a little fast, a little loose with the line between his assumptions and other people's decisions, but not malicious. Sitting at that dining table with no folder in front of me, I thought about the Christmas hosting. I thought about how it had worked. I thought about how smoothly it had worked. And I thought about 11 acres outside the city that were worth considerably more than a Christmas dinner. Mark opened his folder with the ease of a man who had done this many times in many rooms and expected the room to follow him. He spread the proposal across the table in front of him. 3 pages, printed cleanly, the kind of document that signals that decisions have already been made and what remains is paperwork. He handed a copy to my mother. He handed a copy to my father. He did not hand a copy to me. He began walking through it. The proposal divided the 11 acres into 2 parcels. The division was not equal. The smaller parcel, the one without the cabin, without road frontage, accessible only through the larger portion or by an easement that did not yet exist, was labeled in clean printed type as David's portion. The larger parcel, with the cabin, with the road access, with the creek frontage that had made the land valuable in the first place, was Mark's portion. Mark explained this structure as the natural result of the fact that he had more capacity to maintain the cabin, which was true in the way that many things are true when they have been arranged to be true. He used the phrase, as David and I discussed, twice in the first 60 seconds. I asked, evenly, whether I could see a copy. He slid his copy across the table without breaking the flow of what he was saying. I read the first page while he talked. I turned to the second page. On the third page, at the bottom, there was a signature line with my name typed beneath it. The line was blank. The signature line had been there from the beginning, sitting at the bottom of a document I had not been given, waiting for me to fill it in. I looked up. I asked him, quietly, when he and I discussed any of this. He waved his hand. Over the summer, he said. The barbecue at my place. We talked about it. I remembered the barbecue. It had been late July, a Sunday, 20 or 30 people in his backyard. I remembered the food and the heat and a long conversation near the back fence with his neighbor about a road project on the north side of the city. I remembered saying goodbye to my parents in the driveway around 8. I did not remember a conversation about the property. I did not remember a conversation that could have been, by any reasonable interpretation, mistaken for an agreement about how 11 acres should be divided between two people. We don't need to relitigate it now, Mark said. He was still smiling, still in the register of a man managing a process rather than answering a question. We just need Mom and Dad to sign off so we can move forward. I'd like to relitigate it now, actually, I said. A small silence moved through the table. My mother looked at her folder. My father looked at me. Mark's smile held for a fraction longer than a smile should need to hold. The way expressions do when the person wearing them is deciding what to do with a room that has not responded as expected. He had been speaking for me for 30 years. He had counted on me to do what I had always done, absorb the version of events he had presented, find it close enough to workable, and let the moment pass. He had built a 3-page proposal around that expectation. He had typed my name beneath a signature line around that expectation. I put the proposal down on the table in front of me and looked at my brother and waited for him to answer the question I had asked. I set the proposal down. I took my phone out of my pocket and placed it on the table in front of me. I did not raise my voice. I told Mark that since we had discussed this so thoroughly, I wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page about what had actually been said and when. I opened the Messages app. I scrolled back through 6 months of our thread, through July, through the barbecue weekend, through August and September, and into the fall. The thread was active the way brothers' threads are active when they are in reasonable contact, but not especially close. Game scores, a question about our father's birthday, a link Mark had sent about a road closure near my office, logistics around a family dinner in September. Normal, low frequency, the digital record of two people who share a history and a family and talk about neither one very directly. There was nothing about the property, not a word, not a reference, not a single message that could be read, even generously, as the beginning of a conversation about 11 acres and a cabin and a signature line at the bottom of a 3-page proposal. I turned the screen toward the table. My mother leaned over and looked at it the way she looks at things when she's being careful not to react before she understands. She scrolled up slightly with one finger. She scrolled back down. She frowned, not dramatically, just the small, focused frown of a woman doing arithmetic on something she had assumed was already settled. She turned to Mark and asked, mildly, whether they had talked about it on the phone instead. Mark said they had. I asked my mother for a second. I opened the call log and scrolled through it. In the last 6 months, there were 3 calls between my number and Mark's. The longest was 1 minute and 50 seconds. The other 2 were under 30 seconds each, the kind of calls that are answered on the way to something else, and end before anything of substance can be said. I turned the screen around again. I placed it on the table. I did not say anything. My mother looked at the screen. She looked at it for long enough that the looking became its own kind of statement. Then she looked at Mark. Mark, she said, when did the 2 of you talk about this? Mom, this isn't the format for. When, Mark? The pause that followed was long enough that everyone at the table had time to understand that the pause itself was the answer. My father, who had been quiet since I arrived, looked up from the folder in front of him and looked at his older son with an expression I recognized. Not surprise exactly, but something that had been waiting a long time for a specific shape to arrive and was now watching it arrive. Mark had spent 30 years in rooms he controlled by controlling the story inside them. He was in the same room he had always been in. The story was no longer his. Mark recovered the way he always recovered. Quickly, smoothly, with the practiced ease of a man who had talked his way through difficult rooms before and trusted his ability to do it again. He leaned back slightly and said that maybe the conversation had been less formal than he had remembered, but that the spirit of it had always been clear. That David lived farther away. That David used the cabin less. That it had seemed natural. Then he turned to my parents and said, "You both know how David is. He doesn't always say things directly." I had heard variations of that sentence my entire life. He doesn't always speak up. He's hard to read. He goes along with things. It was not a lie exactly. I had spent 30 years making it true enough to be usable. I had hosted Christmas. I had let the small things pass. I had developed, through long practice, the habit of absorbing rather than confronting, and Mark had spent 30 years watching me do it and learning what it made possible. I felt the familiar pull of it, even then. The old instinct that said the scene could still be smoothed over, that I could find a version of this that cost the least, that making a moment of it in front of my parents would leave damage that outlasted whatever I was trying to protect. I knew the instinct well. I had followed it many times. I sat with it for a moment and thought about what it would look like to follow it again, to let Mark's reframing stand, to walk out of the dining room with a smaller parcel and a signature on a line that had been prepared for me in advance, to drive home and tell my wife that I hadn't wanted to make it into a thing. I thought about the signature line with my name already typed beneath it. I did not soften. Before I could speak, my mother turned to me. Not to Mark, to me. She asked me directly whether I had ever told Mark I was fine with the cabin going to him. No, I said. I have not been part of any conversation about this property in any form. She nodded once. It was a small nod, slow and deliberate, the kind that means the person doing it has finished deciding something. Then she turned back to Mark, and she did not speak for a long moment. And the silence she held was heavier than anything I could have said, heavier than any version of the argument I had been composing since I sat down. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and even and had something in it I had not heard her direct at either of us since we were children. "Mark, I want you to think very carefully about how you answer this. Did your brother ever agree to any of this?" "Mom, the dynamic between David and me is..." "That isn't an answer." From the far end of the table, my father's voice came in, low, unhurried, the voice of a man who had been watching for a long time and had decided this was the moment to stop watching. "It isn't no." Mark looked at his folder. The room waited. I sat back and let my parents hold the question because they had asked it themselves, and because some reckonings are more complete when the person at the center of them cannot claim he was being attacked by a brother with a grievance. This was not a grievance anymore. It was a question from two people in their 60s who had trusted their older son with things that mattered and were now sitting at their own dining table waiting for him to tell them the truth. I made the decision quietly, the way I make most decisions, without announcing it, without visible preparation. My mother had the room. She was pressing, and my father had joined her, and Mark was on the back foot for the first time since I had walked in. The path of least resistance was to let them run it, to sit back and let the family correct itself around me while I stayed above the argument. I took a breath. I decided against the path of least resistance. I told my parents I was not angry about the property. I said it first because I needed it to be clear and because it was true. The land mattered, but it was not what I was there to talk about anymore. I said the property was not the point. I said the point was that my older brother had arranged a Saturday lunch, produced a folder, distributed a printed 3-page proposal to everyone at the table except me, included a typed signature line with my name beneath it, and had not, in any conversation by any medium at any point in the preceding months, asked me a single question about any of it. I said this was not the first time. I told them about Christmas 2 years earlier. I told them how it had worked, the assumption made on my behalf, the family plans adjusted before I knew, the choice between correcting the record and hosting Christmas. I I told them I had hosted Christmas. I told them about the insurance arrangement Mark had set up for them through his friend, which was fine except that my name had appeared on a secondary contact form I had not filled out. I told them about the refinance discussion, which Mark had described to a mutual friend as something the family had decided when I had not been part of any discussion. I kept my voice level. This was not difficult. I was not performing calm. I was calm, the way you are calm when you have finally decided to say a thing you have known for a long time, and the saying of it feels more like relief than confrontation. Mark interrupted the first time about 90 seconds in. I stopped and let him talk. He said I was reframing things, that the Christmas situation had been a miscommunication, that I was taking a pattern out of context. When he started the second time, I said, "Mark, I sat through your version. You can sit through mine." He stopped. My mother did not look at him. She looked at me with an expression I did not have an immediate name for, something between recognition and apology, the look of a woman understanding a dynamic she had been adjacent to for 30 years without having fully seen it. My father leaned forward. He placed both hands flat on the table, the deliberate gesture of a man settling into something. "Go on, David," he said. I went on. I told them I was not asking for the cabin. I said it plainly, so it could not be reframed as a property dispute or a sibling rivalry over an inheritance. I said I was asking for one thing, that the next time my name appeared on a document, I be the person who put it there. My father said, "That's fair." My mother said, "More than fair." Mark looked at his folder. The proposal sat in the middle of the table. 3 pages, neat and formal, built on 30 years of a brother's reliable silence. I looked at it and thought that it was actually a very clean piece of work, and that it would have succeeded completely, and that the only thing that had stopped it was that I had decided, at some point between sitting down and now, that I was done being the person my silence made it possible to be. I slid the proposal to the center of the table. I did not make a gesture of it. No tearing, no pushing it away with force, no moment of theater. I just moved it out of the space in front of me and said, evenly, that I thought it should be set aside. I said that any decision about the property should be made with all 4 of us present, with full information, and with an attorney my parents chose themselves. Not Mark's friend, not anyone with an existing relationship to one side of the table. My mother said that seemed right. My father nodded. Mark's jaw tightened. He had been quiet since my father had said, "Go on." David, the sustained quiet of a man recalculating rather than conceding, and I had watched him do it while I spoke, and had said what I had to say anyway. Now he came back into the room. He said he had put considerable work into the proposal. He said we were punishing him for trying to organize the family. He said it with some heat, not the full heat of genuine anger, but the managed heat of a man deploying emotion as an argument because the other arguments had not worked. I said that organizing a family was a different thing than authoring an outcome. I said I was willing to talk about the cabin, about the land, about any arrangement that made sense for all of us, as long as we were talking about it for the first time and not for the second. My father stood up. I want to be precise about this because it was unusual. My father does not make gestures. He is a man who has spent 60 years expressing things through stillness, through the quality of his attention, through silences that carry more weight than most people's sentences. He stood up from his chair, which he almost never does at the table, and he walked around to my side, and he put his hand on my shoulder. He said to the room that he had been quiet for a long time about a lot of things. He said he was not going to be quiet any longer. He said that I had just said what he had been trying to say to himself for years and had not found the words for. Then he looked at Mark. His voice did not change. It was the same low, even voice he had used my entire life. "We love you," he said. "We're not signing today. Not anything." Mark's face moved through 3 things in the space of 5 seconds. Anger first, fast and reflexive, the face of a man whose plan has been rejected. Then calculation, the eyes shifting slightly, looking for the angle that remained. Then a small, defeated quiet that settled over him like something finally set down, and I recognized it as the expression of a man who had run out of versions of the story to try. I looked at my brother. I told him I was not angry. I said it because it was still true and because I wanted him to hear it without the noise of a grievance around it. Then I told him I was done. Not done with him, not done being his brother, but done being the brother who let his stories go uncorrected because correcting them would cost something. I said I was going to be in a room from now on. I said it once and did not repeat it. Mark, I'm not going to fight you, I said. I'm just not going to be the silence at the end of your sentences anymore. That's not what this is, he said. It's exactly what this is, I said. I think you know that. He did not answer. There was nothing in the shape of the afternoon left for him to answer with. My mother began clearing the folders from the table. My father went to the kitchen. The proposal sat in the center of the table for a moment, and then my mother picked it up and set it on the sideboard without comment, the way you set aside something you're not throwing away, but are not keeping either. The afternoon ended without dessert. We had come for a Saturday lunch, and we had gotten something else entirely, and there was nothing left to do but gather our things and let the day close around what had happened in it. My father called on Monday morning. He almost never initiates calls. In most of my life, he has been the one who answers, who listens, who responds with more care than volume. I saw his name on my phone and picked up immediately. He said he was proud of me. He said it simply, without preamble, the way he says things he has been holding for a while. Then he said he was sorry it had taken his younger son speaking up for him to find his own voice at his own table. I told him there was nothing to apologize for. I should have said something a long time ago, he said, about a lot of things. You said it Saturday, I said. That counts. It counts more if it keeps being said. It will be, I said. We talked for almost an hour. I cannot remember the last time we talked on the phone for an hour. We talked about the property and about Mark and about some things that had nothing to do with either, and by the end of it, I felt something had shifted in the geography between us. Not dramatically, not all at once, but shifted the way ground shifts permanently and below the surface. My mother's email came on Wednesday. It was long and carefully written, the way she writes when she has been composing something in her head for several days before she sits down. It was not a defense of Mark. It was not an explanation of Mark. It was closer to a confession. She wrote that she had known, on some level, that Mark spoke for the family more than he should, and that she had let it continue because it had been easier than the alternative. She wrote that she had told herself the things he handled were logistics, details, arrangements, and that no one had been hurt by the efficiency of it. She wrote that she understood now that the efficiency had not been free, that someone had been paying for it, that she had not looked carefully enough at who. She wrote that she was going to be more careful from now on about whose words were being used to describe whose positions. I read it twice. I wrote back briefly. I thanked her for writing it and told her it meant something. I did not add anything to it. She had arrived at the understanding herself and written it down clearly and sent it to me, and that was what mattered. She did not need me to grade it. Mark's text came the following Saturday. I read it standing in my kitchen with my coffee. He wrote that he thought the meeting had gotten out of hand and that we should just talk and reset. I put the phone down and went about my morning. The next day, I wrote back one message. I told him I was open to talking, but specifically about something he wanted to apologize for and not about resetting the meeting or smoothing it over. I sent it and did not look at the phone again for the rest of the afternoon. He did not reply for 2 weeks. I did not chase him. I had spent 30 years being the brother who absorbed and adjusted and let things pass, and I had some understanding of how habitual that had become for both of us. How much of our dynamic had been built on his assumption that I would soften and my willingness to confirm it. I was not angry at him. I was not waiting for him. I was simply no longer available to make things easy in the way I had always made them easy, and he was going to have to decide what he wanted to do with that. The property remained undecided. My parents had called a family attorney. Their choice, no prior relationship to anyone at the table. The first meeting was scheduled for the following month. All 4 of us would be there. There would be one set of documents, and everyone would read them before anyone signed anything. My name would appear on them because I had put it there, The property was settled the following spring. 2 follow-up meetings after the first, all 4 of us in the room each time. A neutral attorney my parents had found through their accountant with no prior relationship to anyone at the table. The documents went to each of us separately before any meeting, read in advance, questions submitted before we sat down. Nothing was decided by implication. Nothing was assumed. The cabin went a mark. The road frontage was split along a line that made practical sense. I got a parcel with creek access and a clear boundary and the option to build if I chose to. The outcome, looked at from a certain distance, was not entirely different from what Mark's original proposal had described. The path to it was entirely different. That was the point. That had always been the point. My father and I talk on the phone every Sunday now. It started in the weeks after the meeting and continued without either of us formally deciding it would continue, which is how the best things between people tend to work. We have taken 2 fishing trips, something we had never done when I was a child, because Mark had been the son his father took fishing, and I had grown up accepting that as a fact about the world rather than a habit that could have gone another way. I do not say this with bitterness. I say it because understanding how it happened is part of not letting it continue by default. On the first trip, somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd hour on the water, my father said I had done a hard thing that day. I said I should have done it sooner. He was quiet for a moment. Maybe, he said, but you did it. That's the part that counts. I have thought about that sentence since. I think he was right, and also that he was being generous, and that the generosity was something he was offering me because he had his own version of the same sentence to carry. The long quiet at the table, the years of watching, the hand finally placed on his younger son's shoulder. We had both waited longer than we should have. We were both now trying to be the kind of people who did not wait. Mark and I are cordial. We speak at family events. We do not have private dinners. He has not apologized in any direct or complete way, and I have not asked him to, because I have come to understand that waiting for a specific apology from a specific kind of person is its own form of handing them control of your timeline. What exists between us now is a respect that did not exist before. Not warmth, but something more durable than warmth, the acknowledgement between 2 men that one of them has stopped being a vacancy in his own story and the other has been required to adjust to that fact. On a Sunday afternoon in April, I sat on my back porch with a cup of coffee and thought about the dining table, the folder, the 3-page proposal, the typed signature line with my name beneath it. I thought about my brother standing up in that room and referring 3 times in 2 minutes to what we had already agreed on. I thought about the 30 years of small agreements I had never made, but had never corrected. My brother had told my parents I had already agreed to split the property. I had found out at the family meeting. I had never been asked. I'm now the kind of man who is asked. I made myself that man in one Saturday afternoon, at a dining table, in front of the people whose opinion of me had always mattered most, while a proposal that had been built on my silence sat in the center of the table, waiting for me to do what I had always done. I did not do what I had always done. I carry that afternoon with me. I do not carry the silence that came before it. The silence is over.